It all started with a mountain biking session back in early March of 2010. Where I live in the UK, mountain biking season generally kicks off whenever the frost finally thaws out. Harder, colder ground tends to mean more traction, but it brings a host of other problems, one of which is getting some pretty horrific injuries if you're unlucky enough to bail. Get injured in spring and there's a chance you'll miss out on some pretty dope summer excursions, so it's best to play it safe and wait for weather to soften a little before you attempt any of the gnarlier trails. So cut to March of 2010, it had been one of the coldest winters in living memory, and neither myself nor my best friend turned flatmate had been out biking in months. By the time spring hits, we're so desperate to get out there again that we're just about sweating bullets, and pretty much as soon as the temperature hits double digits again, we're planning on our first proper ride of the year. Then before you know it, we're loading our gear and some lunch into the boot of his car and driving about 15 miles out of town to this massive forest that has the best mountain biking trails in the Northeast. Everything went fine for the first few hours, and it felt incredible to be back biking again. But then something happened that changed my friend forever, to the point where my memory of who he was, seems little more than a ghost now. I'd rather not give his real name out, so we'll just call him Andy. Andy was coming down this massive slope when his front wheel must have hit something that it just couldn't handle. I've never seen anyone come off like that before, like it just flipped his bike and landed him almost squarely on his head. I felt the impact just watching it, like he'd smashed his helmet so badly that the plastic was all cracked up on the top, and for a good few minutes, he was knocked out cold. I think that was one of the most traumatic and terrifying days of my life. Trying to direct an ambulance crew onto our position when I barely had an idea of where exactly we were almost drove me to tears. I thought my best friend in the world was going to die because I was too bloody scared and stupid to be able to think properly. Just thank God that they're trained for that kind of thing, as not every medical emergency happens somewhere with a postcode, and within about 45 minutes of me calling 999, Andy was on a stretcher and being carried to a waiting ambulance. Oh, but let me tell you, that 45 minutes felt like hours at the time. In the immediate aftermath, people described Andy's recovery as a miracle, but that's the last word I'd use in retrospect. Too many connotations and reminders of the horror yet to come. In short, Andy should have broken his neck, and failing that, he should have at least had enough head trauma to put him into a vegetative state. Somehow, whether by luck or the quality of his helmet, he dodged the worst effects, but the doctors still told us to monitor his behavior over the following months and to inform them of anything unusual. The first sign that something was off was how Andy explained his survival. While the rest of us were marveling at the quality of the helmet, how tough Andy was, or how lucky, he'd already made up his mind that the thing that saved him was God. So Andy, who never in a day of his life had been remotely pious in any way, had suddenly decided to take up religion. And not just casually either. He'd once mentioned something about his grandpa being in the Church of England, but for some reason, Andy opted for hardcore Catholicism. Like he stopped staying up late on Saturday nights with me, citing his need to attend morning mass. He cut out meat on Fridays. He even had a go at me at one point for saying, "Jesus Christ, this is good curry," saying if I was going to take the Lord's name in vain like that, to at least not do it around him. I wouldn't take that from anyone else, honestly, but Andy had walked away from a crash that really should have killed him. If religion was his way of dealing with the trauma or whatever, then so be it. But Andy's behavior went from being righteous, if a little bit annoying, to full-on bizarre after a while. He insisted on making up for missed time during Lent by completely abstaining from food or water during daylight hours. When I told him he could just give up chocolate or something, he seemed to take it really personally, like I was doubting he could actually fast like that for a prolonged period. And with that in mind, he set out to prove us all wrong. By the end of week 1, he actually looked pretty good. He was leaner, seemed a bit more alert, and was actually fun to be around at mealtimes because he got so bloody excited about food. But by the end of week 2, he looked awful. He'd actually started pushing himself to see how long he could go without eating or drinking anything. And as you can imagine, that was starting to take a serious toll on his physical and mental health. I know this is bad of me, but for a while I just left him to it, and so did everyone else. I don't think a single person reported his behavior to any of his doctors, mainly because people assumed it was his way of processing the accident. I only really started to worry by week 3, when he stopped coming out of his bedroom almost completely. He looked like boiled poo by then, and you could see his ribcage whenever he raised his arms above his head. I tried to confront Andy about it, and he actually seemed weirdly self-aware. He told me he knew he was taking things a bit far, but it was only a few more days until Easter, and then everything would be back to normal again. We could smash a Nando on the Sunday or something, maybe even get a bike ride in if the weather was good enough. It was a weight off my mind. He seemed lucid again, and I honestly couldn't wait until that Sunday so I could finally have my friend back. So cut to Sunday, the 4th of April, 2010. I'd been on the Jaeger the previous night with a few work friends, so I was absolutely hanging out of my butt when I woke up around lunchtime, and the only thought that got me out of bed was the idea of having a massive hangover munch with Andy, who had promised to be eating properly by then. I get up, have a cup of tea, then notice that the flat seems really quiet. I call out Andy's name, but got no reply, and I remember thinking he probably rushed out to eat his own body weight in burger meat since his fast was finally over. I shrugged it off, thinking like, good for him, or something, then walked back towards my room with coffee in hand. Only right as I'm walking back past Andy's room, I hear like a thumping noise coming from inside his room, one that was followed up with some kind of growl. I stopped dead in my tracks, look towards his door, and call out his name again. Only this time, I actually know there's someone in his room, and I just want to find out why he won't reply. I knock on his door, calling his name for the 3rd time in about as many minutes, but still he won't answer. Something in my gut just told me to open the door and check on him. If it turned out he was getting steamy with Madame Palm and her 5 lovely daughters, it'd be a wee bit embarrassing, but at least I'd know that he was okay. But as it turns out, he most decidedly was not okay. When I opened the door, the room was barely lit, with the curtains drawn and the only light coming from a few candles that Andy had placed around the room. I knew he'd been in the process of getting rid of all of his unneeded possessions, but it wasn't until then that I really realized how seriously he'd taken the whole minimalism thing. I had an idea that a devotion to God would be anything but creepy, but that's exactly what Andy's room looked like. Sparse, gloomy, with enough pages of scripture taped to the walls to really give you that authentic, I'm losing my freaking mind in here look. But the thing that had me running from the room to call Andy his second ambulance in the space of a month was that he was doing this weird thing with his left hand. Andy had somehow managed to get his hand on a large 10-inch long piece of metal, then sharpened off one end into a point. He was then using the sharp end of the metal bolt to puncture the flesh of his palm, and he appeared to be in the process of trying to shove the entire thing into or through his hand. I only caught a brief glimpse of the wound, but it almost knocked me sick, and I still remember the drip, drip, drip sound of the blood dripping off his desk because I bailed out of the room in the direction of my phone. It probably took me longer than it should have to work out what he was doing. It was stigmata. Self-inflicted stigmata anyways. Andy's attempt to replicate the wounds that Jesus received during his crucifixion. What came next was messy to say the least. Because of the whole self-harm element of the 999 call, it was the police that showed up first to make sure he was fit to go to the hospital. What started out as a police request to have a chat with him ended in the police basically dragging Andy to the ambulance, having been deemed a danger to himself and others. To this day, I don't think Andy would have actually hurt me or anyone else for that matter. It was incredibly distressing to watch, but having him taken away for what ended up being a full psychiatric evaluation was probably the best thing for him. Andy lives in a group home now. He's never forgiven me for calling emergency service that day, so we don't really talk anymore. I get updates from his family every now and then, and I've heard he's actually been doing pretty well these days. He's on a shed load of medication, but he doesn't fixate as badly on things, and he doesn't have that manic impulsiveness about him anymore. It's just so crazy to me that a head injury can have such a bizarre and terrifying effect on someone's thought processes. Like Andy isn't even really Andy anymore, not since the accident. He's Andy in name only, and the person inside, the person that wears Andy's face like a mask, is completely different. For decades now, those huddled around their campfires on dark Virginia nights have shared a tale that has made their companions' blood run cold. It is the story of an escaped insane asylum patient, a man committed for the cold-blooded murder of his own family on Easter Sunday. Following his incarceration, he became obsessed with Easter-themed motifs, eggs, crucifixes, and most importantly, rabbits. Because following his freak escape from the psychiatric hospital he was interred at, our family killer escaped into the woods around Colchester Overpass near Clifton, Virginia, where he found his only stable resource of food was rabbit meat. Over time, the escaped mental patient collected the skins of the rabbits he'd killed, somehow stitching them together in something that resembled a huge gore-stained rabbit costume. Anyone unlucky enough to stray into his patch of woods found themselves subjected to the terrifying ordeal of being chased through the trees by an axe-wielding, fur-suited psychopath that soon came to be known as the Bunny Man. But despite the fact that the Bunny Man sounds like nothing but bone-chilling urban legend, the terrifying reality is there's much more truth to the story than we like to admit. Clifton wasn't always the vibrant suburban sprawl that it is now. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was a small and humble farming community centered around the town's only railway station. But as Clifton grew and its population swelled, the residents became unhappy that they were so close to a state insane asylum. The solution was simple. The local government passed a measure to shut the asylum down, with the inmates being temporarily housed in the newly built Lorton prison. However, during transport, one inmate managed to wrestle free from prison guards and escape into some nearby woodland. This prisoner's name was Douglas Griffin. It's a matter of record that a man by that name was convicted of murdering his own parents with an axe on Easter morning when he was just 12 years old. At his hearing, young Douglas seemed manic and deranged, completely absorbed by the Easter imagery present in his home on the day he killed his own mother and father. A judge spared no time in committing him to an insane asylum, and that's where he lived for 20 long years, right up until the day of his escape. Federal marshals, local law enforcement, and a handful of volunteers searched the woods near the site of Griffin's escape for months on end, using sniffer dogs, professional trackers, and even mounted patrols. But the only traces they found of him were the mutilated corpses of several half-eaten rabbits. By October of that year, Douglas Griffin was assumed dead, with law enforcement refusing to believe that he could have survived out in the woods for that long. But after 3 teenagers went missing, the search for them brought police officers right back to the very same area they'd been hunting Douglas Griffin in. Then one night, bloodhounds looking for the kids led officers to a small bridge with a rail line at the top and a road running under the bridge. Hanging from the bridge were the missing teens, disemboweled like the rabbits in the woods. The teens had apparently been walking home and had stumbled across Griffin hiding under the bridge. Moments after making the gruesome discovery, police officers heard a maniacal laughter coming from above them, looking up to see a man in a rabbit's fur mask waving an axe above his head. Police then claimed that Griffin was hit by an oncoming train, although whether or not that's true or just an excuse for their failure to capture him, it's impossible to discern. But that didn't stop local newspapers from pumping out stories detailing the grisly deeds of the Bunny Man of Clifton. As far as I can tell, the Bunny Man legend appears to have started in the 1970s, but has its roots in unrelated real-life events. On the night of October 8, 1970, Air Force Cadet Robert Bennett and his fiancée were driving near Colchester Bridge when Robert spotted something in the middle of the road that had him slamming on his brakes to avoid hitting it. It was a man, in what appeared to be a full-body gray suit, one that was completely with, as Robert put it, something that looked a lot like bunny ears. The couple simply stared at the figure, dumbstruck until they noticed the large hatchet in his hand, at which point they drove off again at high speed. Though neither Robert nor his fiancée were hurt, they were shaken by the incident and couldn't provide a lot of details. But with his pale outfit and ear-like head covering, Bennett and police initially speculated that the man was a member of the KKK. The mysterious figure was quickly dubbed the Bunny Man by local newspapers, and it wasn't long before there was a second sighting. Less than 2 weeks later, a construction site security guard making his rounds at a new housing development caught the Bunny Man using an axe to smash the roof supports of new houses being built. After the newspaper ran the story, the Bunny Man called the local authorities saying that he was against the spread of new housing divisions into his woods. Based on his voice and eyewitness accounts, police determined the Bunny Man was a local teen upset with the new housing development. He told police that he would meet them at the Colchester Bridge on Halloween, but never showed and was never seen again. The events were reported in newspapers around the country, and teens from all over Virginia started to make their way to Colchester Bridge to look for the Bunny Man. Over 50 Bunny Man sightings were reported everywhere from Maryland to Washington, D.C., though not a single sighting could be corroborated. The supernatural element of the Bunny Man story only came when locals connected the Bunny Man news reports to an unsolved murder of a local girl that happened in 1918. 14-year-old Eva Roy was found beaten to death and hung near Colchester Bridge, and the prime suspect was an escaped mental patient who broke out of Lorton Prison, though he was eventually proved innocent of the crime. As years passed and the legend spread, teens near the bridge would go on Bunny Man hunts in the woods, especially near Halloween. It seems horrifying that such a ridiculous-sounding story can have so many elements of truth to it. It just makes you wonder, how many other stories, myths, or legends that we're so quick to dismiss as false are actually based on terrifying, real-life events? To say that James Rupert's upbringing was rough would be quite the understatement. Born on April 12th of 1934, his mother Charity had told him from a very early age that she would have preferred having a daughter as her second child, giving him the distinct impression that he was unwanted. Leonard, his father, treated him no better. The family was frequently terrorized by a man whose lack of patience gave way to a violent temper, and he showed his two children very little affection. Yet neither would be given the chance to reconcile, as Leonard died in 1947 when James was just 12 years old. After his father's death, James's older brother, Leonard Jr., became the family patriarch, and to his younger brother's horror, Jr. mimicked his late father's cruel and mocking behavior, often taunting James for being, as he put it, a weakling. By the time he was a young adult, James's awful home life meant that he already had one failed attempt at taking his own life under his belt. He stood at a meager 5'5", weighed just 135 pounds, and was described as a modest, bookish, and helpful young man who was unremarkable and quiet. As a result, for his shy demeanor, James never once got into any trouble with the law and lived most of his life as a law-abiding citizen. But by 1975, the fraternal love James felt towards his brother was wearing thin, and the envy he felt over Leonard Jr.'s successful career and loving family was beginning to boil over. James had dropped out of college after only 2 years, and by the time 1975 came around, he was unemployed, unmarried, and was still living at home with his mother. On the other hand, Leonard Jr. had earned himself a degree in electrical engineering, owned his own home in Fairfield, Ohio, and had 8 children. But what's more, the woman that Jr. had married was none other than James's own ex-girlfriend, Alma. At first, James simply took this in stride, but then again, Jr. was fond of reminding him of it, how she had been right not to marry a weakling such as he. On top of that, James's relationship with his mother didn't seem to have improved over the years. Charity was sick and tired of James's apparent inability to hold a steady job and blasted him for having to self-medicate with alcohol, telling him he was unable to pay the rent, then she'd kick him out onto the street just like any other tenant. Obviously, living through such an unbearable situation took a terrible toll on James's mental health, and by the mid-70s, he found himself battling a deep and unshakable depression as he got closer and closer to the breaking point. He seemed deeply vexed and even mentioned how troubled he was to a 28-year-old waitress named Wanda Bishop. The mother of 5 would later state how, during one of her shifts at the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge, James had told her of his growing frustrations with his mother's demands on him, of his impending eviction, and how he desperately needed to solve both problems. James stayed at the bar until it closed at 2:30 a.m. on Easter Sunday. But by that time, he didn't need to do any more thinking. He had decided on a permanent solution to his woes. Around noon on Easter Sunday of 1975, Leonard Jr. packed his wife and 8 children into his car and drove over to their grandparents' house. When they arrived, James was still upstairs in his bedroom, sleeping off a hangover after his long night of drinking, and was only roused by the sounds of children hunting Easter eggs on the front lawn. He groggily put on some pants and a bathrobe, then went downstairs to greet his family for what would turn out to be the final time. It was just before 4 p.m. when James walked into the family kitchen. His mother was preparing dinner with the aid of both Leonard Jr. and his wife Alma, while the children played in the TV room. Leonard detected his brother's presence before he'd even turned to look at him and made some derisive comment about having slept all afternoon. But when Leonard finally did set eyes on his brother, what he saw made him freeze up in horror. Leonard stood there, eyes bloodshot, hair a mess, pointing a loaded .357 Magnum at his terrified brother. It was the last thing he would ever see. With the barrel aimed squarely at his brother's face, James pulled the revolver's trigger, sending a chunk of lead smashing into Leonard's skull at supersonic speed. His head just about exploded, sending a spray of carbon soup all over his nearby wife. She tried to scream, but James shot her in the head before the sound could ever escape her throat. Her mother simply watched, immobilized with fear as James then turned the gun on her, too. Alarmed at the loud noises coming from the kitchen, 3 of James's nephews and nieces came running to the kitchen to see what was going on. The hellish scene that greeted 11-year-old David, 9-year-old Teresa, and 13-year-old Carol was enough to send them into a frenzy of terrified screams, screams which James didn't hesitate in silencing with shots from his .357. James then walked into the TV room where the execution style of killing devolved into something considerably more frenzied and fear-soaked. 1 child was shot in the chest, but the remaining children were shot as many as 3 times each, evidence that they had attempted to flee as James emptied his chambers, reloaded, then continued firing on his own young family members. Within 5 minutes of James waking up and walking downstairs, his entire immediate family was dead by his own hand. He then called the police to tell them what he'd done, sat down on the couch, and simply waited for the authorities to arrive. The shocking brutality of the killings rocked the small town in which they occurred. Many who were familiar with James Rupert thought him to be incapable of such violent acts and didn't even know that he owned a gun. People were stunned to hear of the hateful tensions that simmered underneath the surface, as by all accounts, the Rupert family were considered a perfectly pleasant and well-adjusted bunch. The very same day he was arrested, James was charged with 11 counts of aggravated homicide. Yet in sharp contrast to his initial cooperation, he refused to participate in any kind of interview. One of the few things James actually said to the arresting officers was that he intended to plead insanity and would escape any kind of punishment, since no jury in the land would find him guilty of murder once they'd heard his story. But the only story that grabbed anyone's attention was the horrific level of violence at the crime scene. County Prosecutor John Holcomb stated that there was so much blood on the first floor of Rupert's home that it was dripping through the floorboards and into the basement. Just over a year later, the house was open to the public and all of its contents were auctioned off. It was then cleaned, recarpeted, and rented to a family new to the area whose members were unaware of the murders that had taken place there. Other families had moved in and out, and the house was frequently occupied, but some complained that there were still bloodstains in the wooden floorboard of the TV room. One family even vacated the house entirely, claiming that they were hearing voices and other explained noises. At his trial, a jury found James Rupert guilty on all 11 counts of murder and sentenced him to 11 consecutive life sentences. Just as he'd promised, James appealed on the grounds that he was insane, and in 1982, defense attorney Hugh D. Holbrook personally funded the hiring of expert psychiatrists and psychologists from all over the country in a bid to prove his client was unfit to stand trial. But thankfully, a judge saw through the act. James was ruled sane, and the life sentences upheld. Rupert remains incarcerated in the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, and has since been denied parole by the prison board. James's next hearing is set for February of 2025, when he will be 90 years old. By that point, James Rupert will have spent more of his life inside a cell than outside of one, and it's doubtful that a 90-year-old man will be able to properly enjoy his final years of freedom. But then again, maybe that's a small measure of justice, since the man stole the life, love, and liberty of 8 of his young relatives. James only narrowly avoided the death penalty for his crimes, so maybe it's only right that he die in prison, where child killers like him most definitely belong. In the year 2001, movie theaters across the country were terrified by the demonic evil of the antagonists in Jeepers Creepers. The movie is the story of a brother-sister duo whose road trip is turned into a living nightmare by an immortal creature who hungers for their body parts. It's certainly a fantastical tale, but you may be surprised to learn that one of the movie's most terrifying scenes is actually very much based on reality. More than a decade prior to the release of the film, a woman named Marilyn Depew was reported missing on Easter Sunday of 1990. Marilyn's neighbors strongly suspected that her husband Dennis was responsible for the disappearance, as it was common knowledge around the neighborhood that the Depews had something of a rocky marriage. Many gossiped that Dennis had violently snapped when Marilyn finally professed a desire to end what had been a miserable marriage. The reality wasn't far off. After severely beating her in front of their 3 children, Dennis Depew lied to them, telling them that he was going to take their mother to the hospital. Instead, Dennis drove the dazed and bloodied Marilyn out into the woods and shot her in the back of the head. Since he was on some pretty isolated Michigan back roads while he was dumping his wife's body, Dennis Depew assumed that he would be undisturbed. It was rare to find any vehicle at all driving down that stretch of road, but as fortune would have it, a married couple by the name of Ray and Marie Thornton were headed Dennis's way. They slowed as they saw an abandoned schoolhouse at the roadside, just in time to catch a glimpse of Dennis Depew, holding a horribly familiar shape wrapped in a bloody off-white sheet. Horrified by what they'd seen, the couple raced down the dirt road only to find that a man who had evidently killed once before was now pursuing them at breakneck speed. The ensuing car chase between Dennis and the Thornton couple will seem eerily familiar to anyone who has watched Jeepers Creepers, since this confrontation is essentially reenacted during the first portion of the movie. Even the build-up to the horrifying discovery is almost identical as, much like the movie's protagonists, the Thorntons also happen to be playing the license plate game. Although director Victor Salva never cited the Depew murder as inspiration, it's rather hard to imagine that he wasn't influenced by it in some way. After failing to catch up with the Thorntons, Dennis Pugh then hid the truck he'd used to chase them, and for a good long while, there was no concrete leads on who killed the woman whose body was found behind that old abandoned church. Then one night, many months later, Dennis sat down to watch an episode of Unsolved Mysteries to find that the focus of that night's feature sounded strangely familiar. The show's narrator detailed a murder that had taken place in rural Michigan, and it also featured the testimony of a young married couple who had been chased down a stretch of highway after having witnessed the disposal of a corpse. The realization hit Dennis like a ton of bricks. They were talking about him and his wife, and by that point he was officially the case's primary suspect. He panicked, jumped into his new truck, and fled to the safety of a hideout in Texas, where he lived for 11 months under an assumed name. But after Hank Queen was discovered to be none other than Dennis DePue, and members of the public contacted law enforcement, it was Dennis's turn to be chased down a lonely stretch of highway, but this time, it was the police that were in hot pursuit. The lengthy chase ended in the state of Mississippi, where Dennis got out of his vehicle, put a pistol to his temple, and pulled the trigger. The footage from the episode of Unsolved Mysteries, the one that sent Dennis into a blind panic, can be found online, and it's fascinating to notice the obvious similarities between the movie and the real-world events. Yet something about the inclusion of an ancient demonic evil seems to take the sting out of the depicted events. We can watch a movie like Jeepers Creepers, then sleep soundly in our beds, safe in the apparent knowledge that it was only a movie. But the fact is, it isn't just a movie. For a good chunk of the film, the events are an exact recreation of a real-life event that almost ended in the brutal murders of a young Michigan couple by an unrepentant, bloodthirsty monster. A man who poses a much more tangible threat than any make-believe movie monster. On Good Friday in the year 1144, the dead body of a young man was discovered in Thorpewood, just outside the city of Norwich, in the southeast of England. As the story goes, the poor boy's corpse lay there undisturbed throughout the Easter weekend. After he was discovered, a handful of local townsfolk ventured out to bury him at the same spot he was found, but not before the boy was identified as a 12-year-old boy named William, son of 2 nearby villagers. Despite there being very little in the way of clues to identify the boy's killer, his parents evidently had their mind made up concerned who was to blame. They were extremely vocal in their wrongly held belief that it was actually a group of local Jewish people that were responsible for their son's death. Given that William was employed as an apprentice tanner, he had occasionally been in contact with some Jewish members of the community. But his family had become enraged at the idea of him working alongside people of a different religion or background. William's family were local Anglo-Saxons, several of whom were married priests following local tradition, and they subsequently demanded that he immediately cease his business dealing with the Jews. And as bizarre as it sounds, the entire belief that local Jewish people were to blame seems to be based solely on a nightmare which William's aunt had. In this nightmare, the aunt said the Jews had attacked her on a quiet road before tearing one of her legs off to take home for supper. Denizens of Norwich confronted the Jewish community as a result, demanding that the local theological courts subject a select few of what was known as a trial by ordeal. This was an archaic judicial practice in which the guilt or innocence of the accused was determined by subjecting them to a dangerous and painful experience. It was a procedure based on the premise that God would help the innocent by performing a miracle on his behalf, or abstain so that the guilty person died during the ordeal, or at least suffered greatly. An example would be that the accused would walk a certain distance or number of paces while holding a red-hot piece of iron. When the trial was over, if there was no wound to be found or it began to heal properly, the person was obviously innocent. However, if the burn was particularly bad, or if the wound festered, the person was deemed guilty and then put to death. Yet all credit is due to the local sheriff, who refused to prosecute anyone based on something as frivolous as a dream, and was quick to remind the local townsfolk that, since the accused were Jewish, that the local Christian courts had no authority over them. Yet such vicious rumors, exacerbated by a prevailing and insidious anti-Semitism, meant that the local Jewish community had to take refuge in the Lord's castle for fear of their neighbors' reprisals. 6 years later, in 1150, a priest named Thomas of Monmouth arrived in Norwich and became obsessed with the story of William's murder. He took it upon himself to act as a kind of amateur detective, scouring the area for clues and interviewing witnesses who claimed to have witnessed the boy's grisly fate. One particular witness swore that he had seen William being taken into the home of a prominent member of the Jewish community. Then, while spying on the family through a hole in the wall, the witness claimed that the boy's kidnappers had taken part in a gruesome, torturous reenactment of Christ's crucifixion, using William as a kind of mock Jesus, cruelly taunting the boy as they nailed him to a wooden cross. The dubious eyewitness also claimed that once William had succumbed to his wounds, that the Jews had unceremoniously dumped his body in some nearby woodland. Having gathered multiple, supposedly truthful accounts, Thomas wrote the following. Having shaved his head, they stabbed it with countless thorn points, and made the blood come horribly from the wounds they made. Some of those present had judged him to be fixed to a cross in mockery of the Lord's passion. Given the obvious dubiousness of such an accusation, yet the willingness of the locals to believe it, historians have speculated that the event marked the beginning of a far-reaching and long-lasting conspiracy known as blood libel. Blood libels typically claim that Jews require human blood for the baking of matzos, which they eat during Passover, although this element was allegedly absent in the earliest cases which claimed that then-contemporary Jews reenacted the crucifixion. The accusations often assert that the blood of the children of Christians is especially coveted, and, historically, blood libel claims have been made in order to account for the otherwise unexplained deaths of children. In some cases, the alleged victims of human sacrifice have become venerated as Christian martyrs, and one of these is none other than our very own William of Norwich, the apprentice tanner. But what would possess a man of the church to traffic in such vicious lies? Well, firstly, there's a good chance that Thomas of Monmouth adopted the anti-Semitism of his new neighbors in order to ingratiate himself. It's also clear that Thomas would have a lot to gain if the boy's death could be venerated as martyrdom, as it would make Norwich a destination for England's many religious pilgrims. With the First Crusade having occurred only 40 years prior, and the Second Crusade only a few years from the beginning, religious pilgrims were most definitely in vogue at the time. Wealthy pilgrims would swell the coffers of Norwich Cathedral and increase the prestige of those that served there, which obviously included Thomas. Over the course of the next 20 years or so, Thomas of Monmouth would write The Life and Passion of St. William, the Martyr of Norwich, an extremely dubious work that was essentially a compilation of lies and baseless accusations. One of these accusations consisted of Thomas's claims that the local sheriff was bribed by the Jews to protect them. Thomas repeatedly invokes God as a source of protection for the people against the corrupt Norman sheriffs, claiming that the sheriff who protected the Jews was subsequently punished with internal bleeding. Thomas also wrote that he spoke to a formerly Jewish convert to Christianity named Theobald of Cambridge, who apparently told Thomas that there was a written prophecy which stated that the Jews would regain control of Israel if they sacrificed a Christian child each year. Every year, according to Theobald, Jewish leaders met in Narbonne to decide who would be asked to perform the sacrifice. In 1144, the Jews of Norwich were assigned the task. Yet despite the book being so full of outright lies and conspiracy theories, what's interesting to note is that the book does actually contain enough information for us to draw our own more accurate conclusions as to what actually happened to him. For example, Thomas of Monmouth seems to have completely ignored the fact that William was last seen in the company of a man claiming to be the Archbishop's cook. This mysterious man personally went to William's mother to ask her permission to employ the young man. This man was never found. and this important detail of the potential suspect was simply weaved into the narrative of anti-Semitism that festered in Thomas's writing. Could this have been William's killer, or was there some other individual or group that was to blame? Despite the fact that the life and passion of St. William the Martyr of Norwich seems to assert that the young man was crucified, it details a catalog of wounds that make it clear that there was no way William was actually crucified. You see, when it was found, parts of William's corpse were burned and blistered, suggesting that he had been tortured by someone pouring boiling water on him. What's more, a small spiny comb known as a teasel had been forced into his mouth, an act not unlike one a modern-day serial killer might commit. William's body showed many other signs of being tortured, including a thorn having been found embedded in his scalp. It's not clear whether or not that was actually the case, since the observation appears to have been made a long while after he was killed. But it's certain that this would have conjured images of Christ's crown of thorns, only further fueling the idea that William's murder was somehow prompted by religious bigotry. Yet there would have been plenty of time and motivation to fabricate, fake, or add such a detail post-mortem, making it impossible to determine the whole truth. Point being, for a person that was supposedly crucified, William's corpse showed very little sign of that actually being the case. Aside from the obvious suspect that of his newfound employer, there was another considerably more horrifying theory that centers around another group of suspects, that of Thomas's own family. We've already covered the fact that Thomas's family was furious at the prospect of him working with the local Jewish community. Could another meeting with them have pushed them over the edge? The idea of William's death being accidental has been flirted with by a handful of historians, and this includes the theory that his murder was simply a punishment beating that went too far. By that line of thinking, his parents then dumped the body in the woods, then waited for it to be discovered so they could scapegoat the Jewish community. If they were indeed the killers, the plan worked perfectly, as there was absolutely no suspicion of them being the culprits at the time. At least, if Thomas of Monmouth's work is to be believed. What makes William of Norwich murder as terrifying as it is fascinating is that not only does the murder of one young boy reveal so much about the attitudes and culture of 12th century England, it also shows us just how ignorant and evil people can be. It shows us how quick we are to harass and scapegoat our fellow man, how we blame them for our own shortcomings. The culture of anti-Semitism in England was so strong at the time that it completely derailed any proper investigation of a young boy's brutal Easter weekend murder and allowed a cold-blooded killer to escape justice. For most Christians, Easter generally falls on a date in late March or early April, but for the Orthodox branch of the Christian Church, Easter can be as late as early May. So on May 1st, 2016, when members of the New York Fire Department responded to a 4-alarm fire at Broadway and West 25th Street, it was Orthodox Easter, which makes it all the more significant that the building on fire was the Serbian Orthodox Cathedral of St. Sava. The structure was built in the 1850s by local Episcopalians and christened the Trinity Chapel, but in the 1930s the church was bought up by the Serbian Orthodox Church before being swiftly renamed. It's a building of such historic significance that it was placed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. It took firefighters nearly 2 hours to stem the blaze, but by that time, the ornate interior of the building had been completely devastated. Priceless hand-carved oak icons were completely scorched, and the fire had destroyed the church's beautiful stained-glass windows. Following an investigation into the cause of the fire, the New York Police Department released a public statement saying that the cause of the fire was down to poor fire safety. Analysis of the scene showed that the blaze had started because of an improperly extinguished candle left unattended following the Easter service. The fire was a huge blow to New York's Orthodox Christian community, and a piece of the city's history had been burned from existence. But what's so disconcerting about the incident is that it was no isolated occurrence, because on the very same day, in the Sydney suburb of Rockdale, Australia, The Macedonian Orthodox Church of the Resurrection was completely torched in a freak fire. The blaze was an extremely volatile one, and 5 of the firefighters who attempted to save the 19th century structure were hospitalized due to falling masonry. Only the brick doorframe and stone sections of the outer walls survived, and police were completely baffled as to how the fire was started. But that wasn't the only Orthodox church in Australia to catch fire during that day. Just hours later, firefighters in East Melbourne responded to a call at the 115-year-old church, the Holy Annunciation of Our Lady, one of the oldest Greek Orthodox places of worship in the entire country. The fire department acted quickly and diligently, putting out the fire in just 30 minutes, and as a result, there was relatively minor damage. But over the several months that followed the fire, investigators were unable to determine its cause. The conventional media had been pretty quiet about the fires, and police have been reluctant to speculate on any links between them. But that hasn't stopped members of the Orthodox Church in both Australia and America demanding that the causes and potential connections be properly investigated. The head of the Serbian Orthodox Church even personally got in touch with the FBI, suggesting that some kind of conspiracy was afoot. It's entirely possible that 3 Orthodox churches simply had electrical issues or unattended candles that led to destructive fires, and that no one is really to blame. But what are the odds of all these fires occurring within 24 hours of each other on one of the church's holiest days? And if the fires actually were deliberate arson attacks, then we're left with some pretty scary implications. Who would target the Orthodox Church of all things, and why would fire be the weapon of choice? What kind of unholy, shadowy organization could operate completely undetected in 3 cities across 2 continents? Hopefully the whole thing is just a horrible coincidence, a bizarre string of events that bear no greater significance, because the alternative might well be too terrifying to comprehend. On Easter Sunday of 1722, the crew of a Dutch ship sailing 2,000 miles off the coast of Chile unexpectedly sighted land. Admiral Jacob Roggeveen pulled out his telescope, scanning the island for signs of habitation, and was astounded by what he saw. The coastline was lined with multitudes of huge, jet-black statues, large heads featuring broad noses, jutting chins, and deep-set slits for eyes rest on standing or squatting torsos. Expressions on the stone faces are solemn, as if the statues are watching over the land or waiting for something. There exists in the midst of the great ocean, in a region where nobody goes, a mysterious and isolated island, wrote the French seafarer and artist Pierre Loti. The island is planted with monstrous great statues, the work of I don't know what race, today degenerate or vanished, its great remains an enigma. Given the date of the discovery, Roggeveen named the island Pasch Eiland, meaning Easter Island in the Dutch language of the 18th century, but the current Polynesian's name of the island is Rapa Nui. Most scholars accept that these so-called Easter Island statues, or moai, were carved by the descendants of Polynesian voyagers who first settled the island during the beginning of the 13th century. A grand total of 887 of the mysterious carved figures have been discovered, ranging in height from 4 to 33 feet, with their discovery having baffled scientists for hundreds of years. It's well established that the moai are carved from stone called tuff, an easily workable compacted volcanic ash, and that primitive stone tools were used to create the faces and designs of the statues. It's also commonly accepted that most of the figures were carved in a quarry located in an extinct volcano on the northeastern part of the island. Yet without animals to pull heavy loads or wheels to move stone or wooden platforms, how did the people of Easter Island transport the giant carvings, some of which weigh more than 80 tons, to their resting place, in some cases more than 11 miles from the quarry? It's a question that captured the public's imagination, and one with some pretty unnerving implications. Some theorists have proposed the islanders drag the statues across the island, using long lengths of hemp-woven rope, while others believe that they were rolled on the trunk of fallen palm trees. Back in 2012, a team of archaeologists and anthropologists from the University of Hawaii and the California State University conducted an experiment in which they walked a 5-ton replica moai on a dirt road in Hawaii using only ropes and manpower. People holding ropes attached to the forehead of the fox moai stood on opposite sides of the road and rocked the statue forward and back, inching it down the path. A third group of movers positioned behind the moai used a rope to keep the statue leaning a bit forward without falling. But given the logistical planning, as well as the engineering skill required for such a feat to be performed, it's not certain if this is the method used by our ancient ancestors. Others offer a completely different explanation. Suri Tuki introduces himself as a descendant of the island's first king, Hatu Matua, who brought the original settlers from an island named Hiva. He claimed his grandmother was the island's last queen. The experts can say whatever they want, Suri says, but we know the truth. The statues walked, with the help of a chief or priest who had mana or supernatural power. According to Rapa Nui religious beliefs, a spiritual force animated the moai. Surprisingly, Tuki's proclamation may actually be the answer scientists have been searching for all these years. Ancient alien prominent Eric von Daniken even speculates that the moai were built and erected by extraterrestrials. But supernatural theories aside, the island of Rapa Nui most definitely signs that those who worship the statues were stricken with some kind of sudden insanity. Some scholars have speculated that when the islanders ran out of resources, they threw their idols down and started killing each other. Archaeologists point to a layer of subsoil with many obsidian spear points as a sign of sudden warfare, and have studied the bones of some 600 individuals from the island, finding numerous signs of trauma, such as blows to the face and head. Islanders say that there was probably cannibalism, as well as carnage, and seem to think no less of their ancestors because of it. But whether or not this is some kind of premeditated intra-tribal warfare or influenced by the malevolent spirits that use the moai statues as a kind of spiritual anchor is impossible to determine. What happened to the people of Rapa Nui, as well as the origin of their humanoid monoliths, is yet another unsolved mystery confined to the pages of history. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, the Bunny Man be bussin'.